He believed that efforts should be made to achieve peace, to make sure that you would not have wars, that you would not have militarism, imperialism, colonialism, all of these issues, kind of getting in the way of a domestic agenda. And he believed these things would be in conflict constantly. And so his argument was that the way to make great progress at home was to also bend hard to achieve peace internationally. Now, that could be frustrating, and Wallace got in trouble for that quite often, because there were people who said he was so much for peace that he didn't anticipate, he didn't understand the Soviet threat, that he didn't anticipate, he didn't understand the challenges of undoing colonialism, that he didn't anticipate, that he didn't understand what would become the Cold War. I would argue, in reading his diaries and reading what he wrote about, that he anticipated it very well. He understood it, and he believed, this is the great divide, he believed the United States could, by example and with diplomacy and with smart coalition building around the world, create an alternative that was so appealing that the U.S. would in fact be a great leader in the world, but it wouldn't be a leader just based on military might. It would also have a vision. And so he fought for that. And he argued if you didn't do that, if you didn't always keep an eye on these two tracks, on achieving peace and on achieving, and this is the other side, domestic progress that had to address fundamental domestic issues, and that was racism, sexism, class divides. One or the other would interrupt. They would always kind of be pulling on each other. And we can sum it up by saying that in the 1950s, when he was pushed aside by Democrats, when Democrats were very, didn't want to be around him because he had broken with the party on fundamental issues. The interesting thing is that he maintained a correspondence with Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower clearly had, Eisenhower and Eisenhower's brother Milton, who was very influential, clearly had high regard for Wallace. They wrote letters, they took counsel, they exchanged ideas, and it got to the point where in 1956, Wallace endorsed Eisenhower over Stevenson. And his argument for that was he believed Eisenhower was more committed to achieving peace, and also that Eisenhower got the need to address racial divisions. And interestingly enough, he was not alone in that. Adam Clayton Powell, the leading African-American member of Congress at the time, also endorsed Eisenhower in 1956. So if we understand the churn at that time, there was still a fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was not where it needed to be, and so it felt pressures all over the place. Fast forward to the 1960s, A. Philip Randolph and others, profoundly influential, the civil rights movement, moving the Democratic Party to the left. And then the amazing reality that Randolph and King developed the Freedom Budget, which in 1966, in that area, they were in the White House talking about basically bringing the Economic Bill of Rights to reality. And Johnson was listening, and other people were listening, John Gardner and people like that. So things were happening, and then Vietnam. And you cannot, it almost proves the whole concept here, that you can start to get great social progress at home, and then you end up with a war that draws down your budget. And they were saying that. Well, we don't have the money for these initiatives at home. I write a lot about it in the book, actually. We don't have money for initiatives at home because we've got this big war on our hands. And if I can just throw one more Wallace element into it, Henry Wallace hoped to live to be 100 years old. He didn't make it. He developed a very serious physical ailment. And in his last days, when he was in his mid to late 70s, he could not speak anymore. In 1965, he communicated with a tablet. He would write things out. And one of the last messages he wrote was that what was happening in Vietnam would destroy all of the progress that they were achieving. And so to the very end, he saw these fundamental realities. And the reason I wrote the book is not to make Wallace into a perfect hero. He made plenty of mistakes. He had flaws. He acknowledged those flaws. But it is to say that we had people along the way who told us where the fault lines were, where the crises were, where the critical junctures were. And they were marginalized. And I think they were marginalized at great cost to the Democratic Party and at great cost to America.
Absolutely. So then what happens in, let's just take the 70s, 80s through Clinton. How does then it start to, basically, I mean, I guess across the board shift to the right, but Matt Stoller had a very interesting piece a couple of years ago where he actually talked about the kind of first phase in the 70s as a decoupling from the the movement against the war in Vietnam, obviously, and some of the kind of social liberalism, not in terms of policy. I think it's important to really start to distinguish those things, but the counterculture more broadly and how that would kind of enforce politics, and people emerging like Jerry Brown. The point of his piece, I'm forgetting the name of it though, is that that some of these people came in with, a good understanding around Vietnam, but actually not much about antitrust legislation at all, and no concern, a total conflation with some of the stagnation, and contradictions and failings of the New Deal with a wholesale rejection of these, massive accomplishments that they'd achieved. And I'm just wondering, and maybe, McGovern and how his relationship with some of the labor unions plays into that. But I guess, what's the next phase that happens here where this starts the Democratic Party starts to move fully to, I guess, what we would call neoliberalism now?
Well, you're tracking it perfectly. This is
I told you, I read you. So
yeah, well, it's not me. It's Matt. Reading Matt and other good people.
Yes, right.
But the book actually tracks right through this. And the argument I would make is that in the mid to late 1960s, people had no idea how incredibly powerful movements were, and these were movements of the left. It didn't mean that they necessarily won every fight, but it meant that they were in the game, and they were multiracial. Kimberly Crenshaw had not given us the word, but they were intersectional. They often understood race, gender, class, the need to pull these issues together. There was a critique of corporate power. It wasn't as strong as perhaps some people might have liked it to be, but it was there. Remember, SDS and what Tom Hayden and other people did, they understood corporate power. They understood it quite well. And so this was all in the mix. I would also add, by the way, that A. Philip Randolph and many of the civil rights campaigners really understood corporate power and really understood the need to link economic justice with racial justice. And so they pushed this. So that it was there. It was alive. It was linked to a massive anti-war movement. And frankly, we lose sight. It was linked to a massive environmental movement that around Earth Day 1970 was huge. And so just as in the 1940s, power became terrified of what Henry Wallace and others like him, A. Philip Randolph and others, were pulling together, so again, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, power became terrified. So imagine this, just within the Democratic Party. In 1968, the leading vote getter in the primaries they had, and they didn't have as many primaries then, was Eugene McCarthy. He got 38% of the vote nationally. The number two vote getter was Bobby Kennedy, who got 31% of the vote. And then, you had some independent African-American candidates in some other places, or African-American leaders in places like D.C., who also were getting substantial numbers of votes for an anti-war, civil rights, social justice agenda. And so when you pull all of these components together, you can say without a question that, the anti-war movement in those primaries, in that process of choosing a Democratic nominee in 68, it got around 70, 75% of the vote. Hubert Humphrey got 2% of the vote in the primaries. Hubert Humphrey got nominated, and he lost. Right. The polls show that had they nominated McCarthy, he was well ahead of Nixon. And so there the party chose its status quo. It chose not to embrace movements. It chose not to go forward, and it crumbled and at a critical point. And now the movements continued. And so 1970, who do you see getting elected to Congress, beating Democratic incumbents? Ron Dellums, a radical out of Oakland, and Berkeley. Bella Abzug, a radical out of New York City. 2 years later, Elizabeth Holtzman beating, one of the senior Democrats in Congress. I mean, these movements continued, and they continued both on the streets, but also to try and fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. 72, a grassroots movement taking advantage of changes in rules, nominates George McGovern for President of the United States. He is backed by a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition. It is quite remarkable what McGovern did. And immediately after he's nominated, elites in the Democratic Party, a huge number. We're talking about former cabinet secretaries, governors, senators, members of Congress, mayors around the country, formed Democrats for Nixon. They actively campaigned, buying full-page ads in newspapers, TV, radio, against their nominee, because their nominee was trying to move them forward, right? So you saw this incredible battle along the way for the soul of the Democratic Party, with the establishment power not giving up an inch. I mean, fighting as hard as it could. And I read all about this in the book, how these battles go back and forth, and it's a tremendous struggle.
I guess I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I just say ultimately, the neoliberals, the corporatists, were always looking for a way in, a way to do it. They changed rules. They canceled midterm conferences. They created superdelegates. They began to open the flood of money into the party. And I would argue that last thing, opening the flood of money into the party, really tipped the balance for a substantial period of time, through the 80s into the 90s, toward really a stark neoliberalism. And it was, at that period, it can be safely said that for a substantial period of time, the soul of the Democratic Party was lost.
I think the big concern too is how did some of these same trajectory, that in parallel to this process, that labor unions started to get blamed for Vietnam and bashed for McGovern, and so this demonizing of the really important and positive legacies of the New Deal, of the Great Society, that were right and correct in terms of economic policies, and basically, if you understood, A. Philip Randolph's agenda was, we're going to get rid of American apartheid and we're going to have a social democracy for everybody.
That's right.
I mean, that's I think basically still the thing, that if you have the kind of politics we have, you're still fighting against a multitude of forces today, because you have to fight against, the brutality and the xenophobia and everything else of the Republican Party. You have to fight against the, woke nonsense neoliberals, and in the 90s you had to fight against the Clinton Democrats. So I guess I want to just speak to that too, because somehow it seems like this class that came in the 70s in Congress, that some of them were great and they kind of became important, almost like gadfly kind of figures. Like Dellums was, he would put out a peace budget in the 80s and it was great and it was cool, but he didn't have much, power in the Democratic Party. And then, some of these other folks came in with, a certain kind of liberalism and anti-Vietnam sentiment. But by the time you get to the 90s, they had made their peace with foreign interventions. And all along the way, they were actually very comfortable with attacking New Deal and Great Society programs and kind of embracing Reagan economics. And maybe even Joe Biden kind of comes in here, because he would be kind of part of that class.
Well, he certainly was at periods along the way.
Yeah.
That's a terrific question, because it gets to the real kind of heart and soul struggles that took place. And a lot of my book is devoted to that period. And there are many heroes, right? And plenty of villains, but many heroes. Jesse Jackson fought against this whole thing. When they formed the Democratic Leadership Council, which was the neoliberal, force that Clinton and others were associated with, Jesse Jackson called them Democrats for the leisure class. And he continued to put forward a vision of economic and social and racial justice that was deeply linked to peace, and that was deeply linked to environmental concerns. And here's the interesting thing about, again, how the Democratic Party, by closing its door, right, by pulling in rather than being open to movements, here they had this amazing thing. The Rainbow Coalition came into being. And what anticipated the future more